I've had the honor and the pleasure of being the editors of the journal Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, which was founded at Smith College 25 years ago, an event that we are celebrating this weekend. But that event is separate and distinct from this one, which is only in some ways coinciding because of visa issues and United States government problems. But we really do want you to think about this as an event in its own right, even though in many ways it exemplifies what Meridians is and its 25-year legacy. So thank you for joining us this evening. And see if I can two-hand this. It is my extraordinary pleasure to welcome you to Smith College and this African Feminist Publishing and Praxis moderated conversation organized by Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism. This event marks the formal launch of a collaboration between Meridians and the Feminist Africa Journal, which was co-founded by Nigerian feminist scholar Amina Mama, who was also an early member of the Meridians Transnational Advisory Board. Based initially at the African Gender Institute of the University of Cape Town in South Africa, from 2002 to 2020, it relocated that year to the African Studies Institute at the University of Ghana at Accra. As luck would have it, Amina attended the 2019 National Women's Studies Association meeting in San Francisco, which I also attended and was speaking about Meridians as part of a panel on feminist journals and journal editors. During the Q&A, Amina stood up, true to form, in the back of the room, and spoke about the particular challenges of engaging in feminist publishing work in the Global South. As luck would further have it, Paula Giddings, Meridian's editor before me, and Beverly Guy-Sheftall, a longtime supporter of Meridians and friend of the journal, were also at NWSA and at that panel. So after a very lively conversation about the differences between feminist journal publishing and editing in the Global South, and especially in Amina's case in Africa versus the United States, we decided to go to dinner together and talk some more about what some possible solutions to that problem might be. It was there that the seed that would lead to this moment of fruition was planted, a collaboration between the Feminist Africa Journal and Meridians, one that would be mutually beneficial and would create a sustainable way to support one another's efforts over the long term and not be reliant on the individuals in the room. And then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and the whole world's plans, including ours, were put on hold. So, although our Quigley Fellow, Zora Steele, who is herself of South African descent, tried to advance the collaboration during the following academic year, it wasn't until the fall of 2023 when we received a grant from the Project on Women and Social Change to support this work that we were able to fully begin to move forward in earnest. Over the course of the next 2 years, we, the staff at Meridians and the staff of Feminist Africa Journal, met regularly over Zoom with the editors of each group and our staff members. And we worked out the plan for a 2-day virtual workshop at which our boards would come together to figure out how and on what we could collaborate, given our shared feminist interests, and concerns. And, just as importantly, what the relevant geopolitical and material differences in the circumstances in which we undertake feminist scholarship, activism, creative work, and publishing are. We had that wonderfully generative and promising meeting in August over a 2-day Zoom workshop at which the editors of the Feminist Africa Journal and the Creative Writing Advisory Board and Editorial Advisory Board of Meridians met. And we'll resume that work tomorrow in this very building over a day-long retreat to continue to work out the details of how we can fruitfully work together. So this moment is one of celebration and one in which we publicly announce this collaboration between Meridians, Feminism, Race, Transnationalism, and the Feminist Africa Journal. As a Smith alum and editor of Meridians, and member of the Meridians community actually since volume 1, number 1, I know that this collaboration is part of a 60-year-long history of Smith collaborations with African feminist thinkers, students, activists, and artists. A history that began with the admission and graduation of Dr. Ngendo Mwangi, who attended Smith College as part of the Kennedy Airlift Program, graduated in 1961, went on to study medicine at the Albert Einstein Medical School, became Kenya's first female physician trained in the United States, and founded the Athi River Clinic for the Maasai people of Kenya. She made a lot of good trouble over the next 40 years. Dr. Mwangi led the way for hundreds of other students from Africa to attend Smith in the ensuing decades, including her daughter, Wambui Mwangi, class of 1990, who established the Smith African Students Alliance while she was at Smith, and went on to make her mother proud with her own feminist activism, as you will hear today. I had the great honor and privilege of studying at Smith with Wambui and joining her as together we made a lot of good trouble here. In addition to the presence of African students, some of the other milestones which President Sarah, who will be joining us at dinner this evening, will articulate for you later, were the establishment, slowly but surely, of an African Studies curriculum, contributions by Smith faculty to the 5-college African Studies program writ large, the presence of African faculty as tenured full-time faculty members, the presence of African artists in residence from throughout the continent at the Smith College Museum of Art, not just the art that was stolen from the continent on display. And Meridian's own little contribution to that was the publication of a special issue on African feminism's cartographies for the 21st century, which will be in the back if you'd care to look at it after this event. And the participation at the African Studies Association meeting in Maputo in 2023, where our editorial advisory board member, Lisa Armstrong, represented Meridians in fine form. Thank you, Lisa, for that. And of course, this moment of the formal collaboration between Feminist Africa Journal and Meridians. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I would like to take a moment to thank all the folks whose labor and support made this event possible. President Sarah Willie LeBreton for her unwavering support for the Meridians Project mission and our aspirations to globalize what we mean by transnational feminist women of color knowledge production. The Project on Women and Social Change for the generous grant funding that enable us to undertake this collaboration so that this event can formally launch and celebrate what we are doing this evening. Our partners in the Alumni Relations and Development, especially Mario Wexler, who is with us here this evening, and Jacqueline DeFelice and Portia Watson, who are not able to attend but are with us in spirit. Our incomparable alumni donors, especially our anonymous lead donor, whose $1 million gift established the Meridians Endowment Fund, and Sylvia Cookie Lewis, who will be joining us this weekend, whose very generous gift was the very first to follow, and who is with us always in spirit at Meridians. And finally, but certainly not least, the Meridian staff. I'm going to ask that you please stand when I call your name so that you can be acknowledged by those in the room. Leanna Owen, Administrative Manager. Alex Terrell, Administrative Assistant and Editorial Coordinator. Carolina de la Piane, Events Coordinator. Our extraordinary student interns, Molly Doyle, Mia Huang, Chiamaka Okorom, Angeli Pereira, and Lynn Tran, who's working outside. Lynn, we love you. Okay. Sorry. I need another hand. Of course, we also want to thank the Alumni House, catering, facilities, and the ITS staff, which, as you saw, was working with us to the very last moment. And last but not least, of course, our esteemed panelists who have traveled to be here with us from Mozambique, Ghana, Mexico City, upstate New York, and virtually from Nairobi, Kenya, where it is now midnight, just about. Looks good at midnight, doesn't she? All right. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Dr. Sandra Manuel is an anthropologist. She took her bachelor's degree from the Universidade Eduardo Mondlane. I should have asked her how to pronounce that properly in Portuguese. Her master's degree from the University of Cape Town and her PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Her career compromises a combination of academic research and lecturing, as well as research towards public policy. She is an experienced researcher with a specific focus on sexuality, gender, and health. She belongs to various networks that question and challenge normative notions of femininity and masculinity, looking at the intersectionality of gendered relations and understanding sociocultural readings of the body and sexuality, specifically in the African context. She joined the editorial board of Feminist Africa Journal in 2023 and has been serving as well on the editorial board of Anthropology Southern Africa. Join me in welcoming Dr. Sandra Manuel. Attorney Abena Takiya Yeboah is the program officer on the Feminist Africa Project at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana at Accra. She completed her BA with honors at the University of Ghana, a Bachelor of Law with honors from Wisconsin International University College in Ghana, her Master's of Law from the University of Johannesburg, and her law degree from the Ghana School of Law. Abena was called to the Ghanaian bar 2 weeks ago, and as of Friday, October 10th, is officially Esquire. I wanted to put it in the program and she wouldn't let me, so I needed to make a point of saying that it's official. Dr. Wambui Mwangi attended Loreto Convent Valley School, Northfield Mount Hermon School, and Smith College, McGill University, and earned a PhD in political theory and international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. At various times, Professor Mwangi has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Vassar College, St. Lawrence University's Kenya program. She has developed a curriculum proposal for the Aga Khan University and guest lectured at Moi University, Nairobi University, Kenyatta University, Page Turner. There's more. And Daystar University. She is primarily interested in critical post-colonial theory, the work of gender, and the material economy of objects and of social text as they interact in global and local economies. She is passionate about public art and founded the multi-year art project Koroga, which remains the largest single publicly available collaboration between Kenyan poets and Kenyan photographers ever produced as a digital archive of contemporary mixed media Kenyan art. Koroga has been exhibited in locations as diverse as the Netherlands, Australia, South Africa, Kenya, Canada, and the United States. Professor Mwangi is also a writer, photographer, painter, playwright, micro-landscape designer, and occasionally also performs oral literature. Her written work, photographs, and paintings and plays have been published, exhibited, or performed both in East Africa and globally at spaces that include the Michael Joseph Center, the Goethe Institute, the French Cultural Center, the East African, the Daily Nation, Kiwani, Feminist Africa Journal, Anglista Ion, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Geopolitics, The Internationalist, The New Inquiry, Too Early for Birds. Most importantly, for our purposes, she contributed a gorgeous visual essay to the special issue of Meridians on African feminisms. The photographs from that essay are on display here tonight, and I invite you to go take a look at them after the event. Thank you for joining us, Professor Mwangi. Jessica Horn is a feminist thinker and builder, a graduate of Armand Hammer United World College, Smith College, and the London School of Economics, as well as the Scenarios program at Oxford's Said Business School. She has worked for over 2 decades supporting activist organizations, funders, and the UN to deepen analysis, shape policy and funding, and refine interventions to define women's rights to health, bodily autonomy, and freedom from violence, and build scenarios for feminist futures. Jessica is a founding member of the African Feminist Forum and has served on the boards of Mama Cash, Urgent Action Fund Africa, Comic Relief International Grants Committee, and the Fund for Global Human Rights. She served as regional director for the Ford Foundation in East Africa, the first African woman in this position in its 60-year history. From 2015 to 2020, she worked as Director of Programs at the African Women's Development Fund, Africa's largest women's fund, where she led a step change in the organization's strategy and programming to accompany a fourfold increase in its budget. She is currently Senior Research Fellow at the Moleskine Foundation. Her writing is published in academic, media, and popular platforms, including The Lancet, Feminist Africa Journal, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Africa is a Country. She is the author of African Feminist Praxis, Cartographies of a Liberatory World Making, just published this spring, documenting generations of African feminist thinking and practice and what it offers as an alternative imaginary for the world. But her very first foray into feminist academic publishing was in Meridians, when she was an undergraduate and was asked to conduct and publish an interview with Edwidge Danticat, which was published in Volume 1, Number 2, 2021. Join me in welcoming Professor Naminata Diabate is an associate professor of comparative literature at Cornell University, where she is also affiliated faculty in feminist gender and sexuality studies, visual studies, literatures in English, romance studies, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender studies, performing and media arts, and Africana Studies and Research Center. In recent years, Professor Diabate held the Robert and Helen Appel Fellowship for Humanists and Social Scientists, which recognizes excellence in teaching, scholarly promise, and dedication to advancing knowledge at Cornell. The Faculty Fellowship for the Society for the Humanities, also at Cornell, and the Ali Mazrui Senior Research Fellowship at the Africa Institute of the United Arab Emirates, where she is also a member of the advisory board of the Africa Institute of the Global Studies University in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. A scholar of trans-African and Black diaspora studies with an emphasis on theories of corporeality, there goes my Dominican tongue, sorry, race, Blackness, sexuality, and gender, Diabate's interdisciplinary methodology seeks to redefine how we understand specific forms of agency in the hyper-digitized and hyper-visual world. With linguistic expertise in Malinke, French, English, Nuti, Spanish, and Latin, she engages multiple cultural productions and oral traditions from Francophone and Anglophone contexts, from Afro-Hispanic America, the Caribbean, and the French Antilles. Her monograph, Naked Agency, Genital Cursing and Biopolitics in Africa, was published by Duke University Press in 2020. It invites theoretical and conceptual reflection on how protest nudity functions as a locus of contestation and subjugation. The book was awarded the African Studies Association's 2021 Best Book Award and the African Literature Association's 2022 First Book Award. It was also the subject of an interview that we published in the current issue of Meridians, 24/2, now available online at DUP and Project Muse. Join me in welcoming Professor Diabate. After this event, both Professor Diabate and Jessica Horan will be available to sign copies of their book, which are available for purchase. So if that's of interest, please stop by the table at the back. And leading our conversation this evening is my dear colleague, Professor Anna Mawaba, class of 2010 graduate of Smith College also. Are you all getting a theme here? Okay. Professor Mawaba is an assistant professor of government. Her research focuses on the role of African international and regional organizations in election observation and democracy promotion in South Africa. Mawaba earned her doctorate in political science from the University of Florida at Gainesville, with concentrations in comparative politics and international relations. At Smith, she teaches courses on Africa's place in international relations, African politics, elections, and political development. This is her first connection to Meridians, and if I play my cards right, it's only the beginning. Thank you all.
Well, it is an honor to moderate this panel with esteemed guests and to engage a conversation about scholarship and activism. So I'll start with my first question to the panel. African feminism is a highly debated term. What does this term mean to each of you, and how would you define it? And how has it evolved as you have worked in these feminist spaces?
I will start.
We can do +1.
Uh, African feminism as a set of women's centered theories and philosophies and practices is both a source of hope and one of terror and anxiety for me. It's a source of hope because if it is loosely designated as a point of departure, the lives and feelings and emotions and practices of women of Africa, from Africa, and of African descent, to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. Let me repeat this. If it takes as a point of departure the lives, the emotions, the feelings, the thinking, the practices of women of this, to contribute to the marketplace of ideas so that women and men and trans can understand and build upon and improve their own lives, I will embrace loosely the term African feminism. But if African feminism means the embrace of what it is, fundamentally to be different from other people in the world, if it is to be entrenched and to pigeonhole ourselves, to particularize ourselves in order to say that we are different from women in India, from women in America, in an attempt to push back against the West, push back against extractivism, push back against violation of centuries of violation, if that's what it means, African feminism, that's what creates terror and anxiety for me. So my understanding of African feminism is twofold. I'm going to stop here for now.
You doing the line? Okay. I love this. And just to say, firstly, that this is a surreal experience for me because my first dorm was down that road. And so in an embodied way, I feel like I'm back in many kinships. One way you'll be pleased to know that I was a very active member of SASA and we kept that fire burning. So yeah, I mean, to me, African feminisms exist in a plural form. So it's certainly not one way, one movement, one set of people. I agree that it's internationalist in vision, so it isn't just parochial or a sense of sort of, thinking about trying to generalize ourselves and think only about ourselves, but it's actually an offering to the world. And I would argue that African feminisms are actually part of the canon of African liberation, because African liberation praxis had, for most of its life, failed to deal with the additional axis of patriarchy. So we are all attentive in African feminisms to the predicament of the continent and its histories, to all of those questions that emerge from there. But we also add in the axis of the questions of patriarchy. And because of that, it's also open to thinking about gender beyond a binary. So African feminisms have emerged in many gendered bodies. And with gendered participation across the spectrum, although I will say that cisgendered men have not been as active in the contributions, but it's not that they couldn't be. And I would just also offer, and again, in as much as it's about a liberatory or freedom movements, it means that then it seeks to create societal imaginations, political, economic, cultural imaginations outside of what exists now. It seeks to create new imaginaries. We want something different, and we work to build a different way. And in that respect, just one last clarification then is I think it's slightly different from women's rights movements that tend to be focused on structural reform or reform of the obvious, of things that happen in the form of visible power. So putting women into government or, getting women into entrepreneurship or even legal reform. What the feminisms are looking to do is to seek to actually even reimagine all of those systems and to create different ways of being and interacting and to completely redistribute power and possibility and, again, the kind of imaginative capacity for changing the world and remaking the world to redistribute that.
I can go next. And for me, African feminism is an exercise of reclaiming African epistemologies, but not from, I really like what Aminata said, not from the idea of making us unique and use that as a kind of a trophy, but in a negative sense to differentiate Africans from the rest of the globe. We do share similarities, and we do, as part of humanity, share those similarities. So in that sense, it's an exercise that wants to bring up the diversity that exists in the continent and start to imagine a world where such views, ways of life, daily experience, bodily experiences can be theorized but used in our everyday practices. So I also say imagination, imagining something new is the way I understand feminism, is the way that guides me in my writing, in from going back to pre-colonial practices, but see how in so diverse ways in everyday practices as an anthropologist, I see how some of the details of such practices are still present in our current times. So I see feminism as this space that allows to imagine through this exercise that it's historical, but it's also contemporary, to imagine something new and create something else for the future.
Thank you. So for me, African feminism represents collective, and there are different groups of people on the African continent. And so African feminism is the collective organizing of all these people who are advocating for the different rights and different things, different stories of African women and men and people of other genders on the continent. And I think this is really important because most of the countries on the continent were colonized. So it's important work that moves from the colonization, from patriarchy, and all the other things that that institution represents. And I think it's a really important work. Thank you.
Who would you like to go and give? And
Oh, is it me?
yes.
Oh,
Sorry,
sorry.
that's my
I'm just
job.
looking back over my notes. I feel I should say at this point that, we got these questions ahead of time. With the result that I looked really hard at it, and then I got stuck at highly debated, because I was thinking, why is it highly debated? What might we be debating? I think the fact that we all seem to accept that African feminism is a highly debated part is itself worthy of a question. Why I mean, it's not as if we're going to come up with a definitive answer, is it? Right? And it's not as if the preceding terms, that is one, what is an African? Because this is already a quagmire of a place that I mean, it's already in very active flux. And then there's this other question of what it means, what feminisms are, or what feminist is. And there's a strange way in which I think that people think of it as sort of a Venn diagram, which you put this already contentious term in a circle, and then feminism is another circle, and then the points at which they intersect, and we all know to love intersections, there'll be that shaded in between area that is African feminisms, and I think that I think I'm a little wary of all the terms. I'm honestly not able to articulate with any particular degree of satisfaction to myself what an African is. Neither am I particularly satisfied with certainly my own state of thinking about feminisms. I find it gravely wanting. So in this class, am I just allowed to say that I don't know?
Absolutely. I think that is an
Okay,
answer
I don't
to the
know.
question. And there was some nodding in the panel. If anyone wants to add to that, please feel free before I move to my next question about the complexities of what is an African, what feminism. Aminata?
I mean, I think that's a fair comment and standpoint. This debate has been going on since the beginning of this, of the formalization of something called African feminism. So it's not a new debate. Some of us have already explored it and have come to a definition, thinking this is where we are, and we're going to take a direction and move our work in a way, and some are still questioning it. So I think it is fair. We are on different trajectories. So I think it is fair to still, question it. So, but some are already somewhere else.
So building on this question, Feminist Africa has been a crucial platform for African feminist scholarship and activism over 2 decades, engaging in these really difficult conversations. What role has the journal played in shaping discourse and building community? What have been the unique challenges of sustaining this work intellectually, institutionally, and materially?
Well, I would say Feminist Africa is more than a journal. It's a collective. Okay. Is it okay? Mm-hmm. So it's a collective, and a Pan-African collective that brings to the fore African women, African people of different genders that have an interest in discussing issues related to feminism, to gender, in the current state of the African continent. We do bring to this space the diversity of themes for analysis through those lenses. So in that sense, it created this Pan-African platform of ideas, of views and debates, because there's not necessarily agreement and conformity in the discussions in the African context. And I think the journal has been able to bring those debates to the fore. So in terms of creating a community, I think that has been the role of the journal. But also I think theoretically, and even in terms of even conceptually and epistemologically, the journal has made a statement in terms of what are the different debates, views on this topic in the continent. And it helped shape, because it's a double diamond journal, meaning you don't pay to publish and you don't pay to get access to the journal. It's freely available. It has reached huge number of interested people within the continent and elsewhere. it is true that it's a platform that it's anchored in the English language, which is a challenge because the African continent is diverse in terms of language, but we do respond to that through projects that aim to translate at least some of the issues or some of the articles in the different articles to French, Portuguese, and Arabic in order to reach a wider number of audience. Thank you.
Just to add to that, so the journal, as Sandra said, is a collective. So it's a combination of people who work in academic spaces and people who are activists, and some people wear both hats. And by discussing different topics in feminist topics, the journal reaches a wide audience. And okay, I don't have a copy here, but the journal is a collective or a collection of articles, in conversations, which are interviews with people, profiles, standpoints, and reviews. And in that sense, it's not a typical journal because it reaches a diverse audience. And it's not just people who are interested in academic, like the academic language or things written in academic language. Also, the journal organizes workshops and conferences, and we strive to pull up other people or early career researchers who are interested in writing and putting across their views. So, for example, we have a workshop that's coming up in Uganda in the next 3 weeks, and it's for early career researchers. And what we did was we didn't restrict it to people who are interested in publishing with Feminist Africa. We opened it to early career researchers who are based in Africa who want to publish an academic article. So our aim is that at the end of that workshop, there are about 14 people who were accepted to come to the workshop. So our aim is that at the end of that workshop, those 14 people will be able to publish in journals, not necessarily Feminist Africa, but they produce quality journals. And we think that that's a really good place to start from. And that's one of the ways in which we reach out to other people and also, what's the word? And build up feminist values. Yeah, thank you.
So as someone who studies African agency and an international relations standpoint, the idea of agency resonated through all your work. And so I wanted to ask, when you hear the term agency in African feminist context, what comes to mind? And Aminata, you rethink how the body becomes political terrain in naked agency. Jessica, you frame praxis as an embodied ethic. Wambui, you write that still life is still life, suggesting presence and absence. How does embodiment or even stillness expand what we understand as agency?
Wambui should go first.
Oh,
Leave it up to the panel.
I'm sorry, but I was thinking of this very hallowed African tradition where if there's an older woman in the room and then there are younger women in the room, the older woman really shouldn't have to do much work at all because we should all be able to be like my grandmother who could say, can you come and just hand me this glass that is 6 inches away from my hand because it's too much work for me to do it. So I was kind of hoping I'd be able to, listen to all of you and then just add a little flourish, but okay, let me give this a shot. I have been thinking a lot about survivability, most especially with the events currently unfolding in the United States over there. I've been thinking about notions of survival. And yeah, it does have to do something with presences. I mean, something to do with presences and absences. But I think, I think agency, and this is why I'm a little bit of a nerd, I think agency is the capacity to act on the world, act in the world with um, intentionality, uh, with the motivation of understanding that every day, every moment that you're breathing, every moment that you survive is another moment that you can exert being in the world. Again, I'm not sure if I'm particularly satisfied with my own answer, but can I let it just rest there for a bit?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, let me take a stab at it. You know, agency is one of those terms that has filled libraries because such a fundamental concept that defines what it is to be an entity, whether it's a living entity, a sentient, non-sentient. Because when we go, I'm a comparatist, when you go to the etymology of the term, agency just means action. When you go to the Latin origin, it just means action. Since every action has an effect, agency means action. And before, it had two meanings. It meant representing. That's why you have the agency, any agency that will represent whatever, a government, okay. That's the origin. So fast forward to the Enlightenment. Agency now accrued the meaning of intentionality or rationality, which Mamboui just referred to. That's the contribution of the Enlightenment, which was not part of the ancient meaning. At least now I'm talking about English. Because since I'm a native speaker of French, the term agency with rationality does not transfer into French. Because in French, agency say, and that's a new term, agentivité. And they even had to borrow the term agency, agencé, because it doesn't, the term agency in terms of agency with rationality doesn't exist. It's a new invention. It's, anyway. Fast forward 18th century, 19th century, agency, rationality. So now, if we do the comparison in African studies, there are volumes. I did a Google Ngram. There are volumes of volumes about Africa. If you do African agency, volumes. Now, if you do the same thing in French, probably 3 or 4 books, or 3 or 5 books, article about agency and African. Why do we have that discrepancy? Because there are as many African in Francophone Africa as you will have in Anglophone Africa. So what are the institutions, I'm talking about scholarly and academic, what are the institutions that are partaking in having that discrepancy? So that's the one question that we can ask ourselves. Because there are some institutions, some traditions that are behind that discrepancy. Okay, so that's one point. The second one is, what does it mean for us to say somebody has agency? That is a recreating the Enlightenment infused, oriented account of agency. So that's why in my thinking about agency, I don't think somebody has agency and stop there, because even a rat has agency. I mean, it's true, even a baby has agency. Every entity that has the capacity to act. Now I'm interested in the texture. What is the texture? Because for me, that's how we ought to be interested in. What is the quality? What is the texture? So I'm going back to the etymological charge of it. It's action with effect. So to think that, oh, this woman has agency, what about those who don't have that spectacular capacity to show that they are contesting in there. So what do we do with those? Because the same happens in Black studies, the slave narratives. What about those non-spectacular forms of resistance? What do we do with those? Okay, so I'm gonna stop here. I have so much to say about this. Probably that's why I wrote a book on it.
I was going to say the book is called Naked Agency. So here we are, Prof. Jabate with the expertise. I agree. And I mean, I think, so I come more from the Anglophone tradition because I speak English and I'm, come from Uganda, etc. So I understand in a way that lineage, that particular colonial lineage of colonial Britain and what it did. Part of the reason for our obsession with agency is because actually the narrative that was constructed of the African and certainly of the woman, and then in your Venn diagram of the African woman, was completely unagented. In fact, it is true that even a rat has agency, but the idea is we weren't even rats, so we were kind of excluded from the narrative of capacity. And still to this day, so much of the kind of popular narrative framing would be of people who only have desires or people who are silenced and have no voice, or right, all of this idea of kind of being non-entities and entities therefore without agency. So it becomes really critical. I'm a practitioner, and so in a way, as a practitioner, acting sort of lies at the heart of it. And so, of course, if I'm writing or thinking about practice, it becomes a study of agency because you're looking at what do we do, But I insisted on praxis because my point is that all of our doing is ultimately forms of deep thought. We don't just do animalistically or do out of urges, right? Everything is thought through and channeled and deep and arises out of interesting capacities and takes on things, and it's not all the same. Yes, it's embodied because we live in our bodies, right? This is the beginning place of all of those conversations. And it was actually Wambui in an old edition of Kwani who said that, African women have the most public-private parts in the history of the world. And so there has been a historic obsession with our bodies and our embodiment. If you think of our poor sister Sachi Bartman, who ended up, imprisoned in a museum in Paris with strange white scientists and the public poking at her genitals. We have these long, bizarre histories of this kind of obsession, on the one hand with our embodiment, and at the same time, complete lack of interest in our inscapes, internal landscapes, in our thinking, in our, the other elements of our lives. So we've had to, and have always ended up in situations, given the prevailing power of colonial and post-colonial life, we've ended up acting in interesting ways with our own bodies. One of the initiatives that I'm engaged with that I also write about in the book is called The Temple of Her Skin, which is actually a photo and film exploration of African women in our tattooing and scarification journeys. It's because I come from a community of women who tattoo in contemporary times. And, we were interested because the way that we're represented is always as something, objectified and exotic, if it's even present at all in a tattoo culture, as a conversation. But for us, we were interested in a very different way of thinking about it and documenting, actually, like I said, the inner lives and the ways that then our skin speaks, right, aesthetically, and speaks to our inner lives, our ancestries, our current imaginings, our crazy ideas. Lastly, just to say though, that the body is not only individual. And it's actually critical then to think about, if we say agency is embodied, to think about how it acts in the individual body, but also in the social body, and ultimately in the body politic. Our agency is also situated in systems of power and representation, and and capacity. Again, and how it's structured in structural power. And so we have to look at it there too. And I think it's very critical to do that because, again, another end result of that kind of colonial narrative of the idea that we are nothings is this idea that we're therefore, how could a nothing be capable of changing the world, right? Or how could a nothing be capable of offering a brilliant idea? And so it's also important that we think about not just us as individuals, but again, through the social body and the body politic and what that tells us or helps us understand about the nature of our existence.
Thank you. So much to unpack there. So you all mentioned thinking about power and agency. Oh, yes, please. Ananta, please.
No, can I just add something to this? I'm just, who is the target of our publishing? Who is the audience? Because I'm hearing our bodies, the colonial impact, because I grew up in Cote d'Ivoire, and until the 1980s, we didn't have TV. And I know in Cote d'Ivoire, probably very few people were exposed to the colonial images. Because it's only when I came to the United States for my graduate school in 2000 that I was exposed to the racist images of Black women. So who are we talking to? Who is the target of our writings on our theorizing? Because I ask myself that question every day. Who am I writing to? Because if I think that the images that, I just finished a book on pleasure and displeasure. Who am I writing for? Because my theorizing cannot be for the West, although it is. The West as its, floating signifier, right, in this case. It's not for women in Cote d'Ivoire, because I don't think probably now we be exposed to social media images of, races, but I don't think they were exposed to how they were portrayed, the Sarah Bartman images. No, I don't think that's how they related to their bodies. So I think we have to be a little bit more granular and take cases by cases. Probably the idea in East Africa is very different from other parts of, West Africa and Francophone Africa. That's all I'm calling for. Probably a more granular approach. And I think all of Africa, that women had a different relationship with their bodies because of the colonial racism, which I do not reject. That is a fact. But I don't think that the effect was across the board. That's all I'm calling for.
And so just one clarification, I wasn't only talking about that, about representation and ideas of the self, of beauty, etc. at all. There are many, many implications of this. Just quickly, in health policy, for example, the nature of research that happens. At the International AIDS Conference, for example, where I attended, they had looked at this issue of why is it that the rising HIV cases are primarily in younger African women across the board, and trying to understand what's going on there, which is largely related to transactional sex. But also they discovered some biological issues which are around the presence of a certain kind of bacteria, okay? Now, it was very interesting to hear these scientists, who are all from US universities, talk about our bodies across the board, and then there, of course, policy prescriptions for what should be done. And the ways that it was talked about was as if, again, the objects of their study were completely disembodied. There was no analysis of the environment within which women are operating, the power dynamics, et cetera. So it's to me, because I don't exist in the US conversations on race, to me, it's not just that objectification and a critique of objectification in that way at all. This thing has multiple implications, I think, and echoes across history, including in the skin bleaching obsessions in Dakar and whatever. It's not that that doesn't exist, but I feel like it's multiple. But unfortunately, in grand scale, we have been positioned in these odd ways. So we live ourselves in multiple worlds, the worlds of affirmation of the touch of our grandmothers, our contemporary fun with sister friends, this policy environment that tends to objectify and marginalize. We live in, I feel like, across lots of different terrains. And it's true then that that requires a textured, exploration, and maybe allowing us to be not just Africans, as you're both saying, but to be, ourselves in environments that vary a little bit and have texture too.
Wambui, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Perhaps again, in something that I clearly do a lot, is I spend a lot of time thinking of the discontinuity of categories and classes. And I like to think through the ways in which certain things interrupt ways of thinking and puncture and punctuate them and make them maybe a little unwieldy, but also perhaps more useful to think through. So this is all to say that I love all the ideas I'm hearing. I feel smart, honestly, almost being in the same room with you. This is just a fantastic gift. Thank you all so much. But I'd like to go back to this question of agency, please, and say that, just because right now there is, I think in a room adjacent to you or somewhere else, a bunch of pictures of objects. And I think that as both a scholar and a person who works with images and then who photographs things, I might want to suggest a more variegated idea of what is agentic, because actually that photo essay is about how agentic I find quite a lot of objects. That objects can, on some ways, precisely by their capacity to circulate amongst us and also to carry meanings between us, can themselves be quite agentic. And I wish I could claim credit for this idea, but I think I got that from the Jane Bennett, that's not the Jane Bennett of Feminist Africa, but the other Jane Bennett, who I think is a political scientist maybe, and her work around the kinds, not only the kinds of human meanings that we can infuse objects with, which objects then become agentic to the extent that they can indeed cause, I don't know if it's so much action as I would think of it as motion as well as emotion, right? Which in itself is a way of moving the human towards or away something else. But also that objects in and of themselves and in a way that is not tethered to the human meaning or to human interventions or human symbolism or imagery or allegory or metaphor or any of those nice things we have of explaining the material world to ourselves, that objects themselves are always sort of acting in that, I don't know, they sit, so they can deteriorate, they get older, they can move, there's quite a lot of things that objects do. And one of the ways of maybe sort of anchoring this thought is because I come from a farming people, is to think about compost and the way that it gradually creates another thing out of itself that has not necessarily anything to do with us. So I think it's useful to slightly complicate and perhaps interrupt that strict barrier between humans as human beings, as having agency, as distinct from, first of all, other kinds of animals, which honestly, forgive me, but I think that we should in fact think quite deeply about which other species exert agency in the world and how they do it and what it means or might mean or might be able to teach us. Because one of the many failings of the current human race is precisely this capacity for human exceptionalism, in which our ways of being and doing and exerting upon the world are the only other ones that we think are the most important, for the sake perhaps of developing a more holistic and a more rooted and grounded way of thinking through lived human experience. I think it might be worthwhile to interrupt both the idea of agency as being centered on human beings and also the idea of agency as pertaining exclusively to sentience or even to aliveness, to the extent that, for example, a book, I mean, it's alive in a weird way, isn't it? To the extent that it can change your mind, that it can grow your mind, that it can shrink. I mean, a book can act on you in ways that are so many and so myriad, and yet it would seem to you that you're perfectly in control because you're, after all, the person holding the book and turning the page and whose eyes are reading the lines and etc. But clearly, a book is a very agentic, especially good books, especially the books that you have written. They are agentic. They change things. When I read them, I don't think the same way as I did before I read them. So, and also, especially since you're going to be talking about journals and publications, which in that long ago mystical time in the past, when I was in college, these things came only in paper, right? They were actual objects. So for me, the question of agency, embodiment, and materiality are perhaps articulated in a slightly different and still unfolding way. So, okay, that's a little bit of a fuller response than before. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That actually ties really well to my next question, which I think will have be my last question, so I can allow the audience to also ask their questions, 'cause I'm sure they have many. Thinking of how we share knowledge and how we share our lived experiences, storytelling, oral histories, digital media, and art are central to preserving activist memory. How do you see the role of these forms in keeping resistance alive? What tensions arise and what gets preserved, prioritized, or made accessible? So even looking beyond books, the other ways in which we share our knowledge and share our experiences and pass that down through generations and generations.
Well, I think this question links to my the discussion that we had at the beginning about how do you understand feminism? And I think it links beautifully with the question because I feel as an anthropologist, I do a lot of ethnographic work, staying, being there. And I get so much through songs, for instance. I'm not very fluent in the local languages, but I'm learning through songs. And I learn about my specific focus of research is sexuality, and learning about how stories, words, meanings have a complete disconnect with so many things that are translated into lingua franca, which in Mozambique is Portuguese. And that passing from one generation to the other, the designs, conceptualizes the cosmologies that guide people in their everyday living and their embodied experiences. So I think it's my understanding of how to use feminist lenses in the context of the African continent is through that. Is through that, mostly through those forms of communication that are not necessarily written and shared widely. Yeah, but I think it links again to the question, who are we writing for? And I really like that question because in my particular writing, too often I feel like I'm writing in a corrective manner. It feels like I want to tell that story, to say that the story that has been told is not exactly like that. But then I feel like, am I not trapped? As an African scholar, my scholarship is to correct. Shouldn't it be to create? So this is something that it really is difficult, but at the same time you feel pushed to, no, but what I'm reading, much of my academic life has been reading things that I don't see happening in reality. So this is something that I would like to leave here. How do we deal with that? You that have more experience than I do, how do you deal with that? Thanks.
Echo that question, please.
I think you will open up. You know, for me, it was I just pivoted. It's such an exhausting orientation to be pushing back. That's a pushback scholarship. I came back to the US in 2004 to did my graduate and went to Cornell. In my department of comparative literature, I'm the only Africanist, and very generous department. Nobody knows where Africa is. They're very generous, frankly speaking. What does it mean to be pushing back? After 60 years, African studies has been in the United States here. Volumes have been written about African agency, which we have now called the agency framework. Whether they use the term agency or not, it has always been about asserting African agency. There is a volume coming out. What is Liz? Liz Jacobs. She was at Stanford when I give the keynote speak on African agency at Stanford. The agency framework has been floating around in the US, African studies, since its inception, the US Academy in Europe. We are human, we have been human, we are human, who cares? You can write 20 million libraries, they don't care. Who are you writing for? Enough already. If the knowledge you are creating is to tell the world that you're human, you have demonstrated that enough. If it is to enrich the world knowledge, please do that. Show the world that this is what we're bringing to the table. Enough telling people they're racist, enough. I don't want to preach here. The Black woman rant, not for you. That's what I tell my students. So I just shifted. I'm tired. I want to write a scholarship that invites people and tell them, I'm originally Malenke from Cote d'Ivoire. What does agency means in Malenke? What is the genealogy of the term? How do people read it? What is the concept? Where did it get into the language? Malenke people have been in contact with the Arabs since the 7th century. What does the world know about that? Instead of telling the world you've denied African agency, who cares? That's the work that I've been trying to do, just pivoted. Enough already.
There's, yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, I spent most of my, because like I said, I'm a practitioner. I spent most of my practice around other Africans. So I think also sometimes when you shift even the community that you work with, the questions start to change because you don't have to explain certain things to people. You just keep it moving and you're focusing on the things you're interested in. So part of the idea of writing this book on Praxis was just, it's like almost like a praise song is how I see it. But there is not in writing very much about the practice, actually. And so it was just a process of considering how to tell those stories. But I was just very insistent on a citational approach that meant, it's about 98, basically almost all citation is of other African feminists in different forms, because we don't all write, books or peer-reviewed articles, they're in there, but there's also links to YouTube, speeches, there's songs, there's poetry, there's DMs, there's Twitter, posts, because that's also where the sites where we produce knowledge. And again, it's intended as a kind of map or a set of breadcrumbs so that you can also go and explore more and find. Just one quick example of something that I include in the book, though, is Moon Girls, which is a graphic novel series that was developed by Akuse Hansen, who is a Ghanaian DJ, theater practitioner, and she created this superhero comic, which is based on 4 queer African superheroes, and also really explores particularly Ga, but other traditional African spiritual practices and understandings of the world from the context where she's from in Ghana, as some of the kind of superpowers that are summoned in this series. So I think we're also offering such, in demographic terms, already 1 in 5 people in the world is an African, okay? 1 in 5 people in the world is an African. So there's no way that we have one experience, and no way that we also do or tell stories or act on the world in one way. And so I love this massive expansion, and I think also the tools that we have at our disposal these days with online, with the capacity to kind of develop and create and distribute autonomously, has enabled, I think, a massive expansion of our expression, of the capacity for it to travel. You know, it can travel faster. And so I think that there's this huge garden of things also, and there's a huge garden of stories. So it's about us also engaging more broadly and being a bit more curious in terms of what is there, but also true in terms of, you know, what we're producing and how we go about it.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything else to this question? Abhinav, would you like to?
Okay. I was just thinking that in Ghana, there are different ways that we pass on knowledge. And knowledge is passed on through songs, through games, through art, through architecture, and through cloth. So, for example, the African prints she's wearing, we have a lot of those in Ghana, and they all have different names. And that's some of the ways in which we pass on knowledge. And she said funeral garments. I'll go into funerals. So, for instance, when we have funerals, especially if the person is a prominent person, the family chooses a cloth that has a name that describes the person's character or the person's importance. And that's one way we pass on knowledge. So when you see a picture, for instance, I think I saw my great-grandmother's funeral, the picture of the cloth, and my mom explained to me what the fabric meant and why that was chosen. And so that's one way we preserve knowledge, and it's also one way of reaching people who are not literate in a specific language. And I think I think that's about it. I don't have anything more to add. Thank you.
I just wanted to point out this women's, this is March 8. You see the number 8? So it's the celebration of March 8. So this is a cloth, I think most countries that have this. So this is a way of preserving, you know, the celebration of March 8. I wore it specifically for you.
Thank you so much. As a panelist, know I have a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over to the audience, which the audience also has a lot of questions to ask you after everything you shared with us today. So I'm going to turn over to the audience and let the panelists maybe field questions.
Sure, and just ask my question or, all right. Okay, sure. My name is Maria. I am a member of faculty at the African Studies Department, and I also teach some gender and sexuality courses and some law courses. So yeah, so my question, well, a quick comment, if you pardon me. I really loved the idea of observing other species to see how they exercise agency. So my tiny black cat has taught me so much. I say she's an African feminist, and I know Abina will understand because you're Akan also. So as an Akan woman, the symbol for, or the animal for my father's clan is a leopard or panther. So I always call her my Black Panther. And she refuses to let me trim her nails. So this tiny creature essentially has taught me to stand up for my rights. So thank you so much for sharing that. But my quick question or for myself and on behalf of my students, I hope some of them are here because I said I would give them bonus marks if they attended. My quick question is that we've been talking about current and emerging issues, and I know those are loaded terms, so I know that there are expert linguists on the panel, so please indulge me. But if you'll indulge me for those terms, are there anything or are there certain things that are going on now with regards to or in connection to African feminism or feminisms that give you lots of hope? I've been so inspired by the images from protests, and when I went to Ghana for my field work, I participated in a few of those that have been successful. So affirmative action law, has gone through, and I'm so happy. I literally went to the protest. But if there are any things like that that you can share, I'd be so encouraged. Thank you.
Well, for me, it's I really am enjoying the trend that is emerging about the discussion on the meanings of gender. What does the concept mean, and how should we apply? How should we use it? Does it make sense to use it as it is? Does it incorporate diversity from different ways of lived experiences? So I'm writing about that and excited about the directions that I see happening.
Would you like to go?
Um,
No?
unless
Okay.
you do.
Just checking. No, I'm just checking. Jessica, please.
Yeah, no, there's always stuff on. I mean, we're very active, but one of the sort of quiet movements that I'm quite enjoying, maybe because of my basis in medical anthropology, is actually kind of the rising kind of presence of two things. One is healing practitioners who are actually rooted in different kinds of methodologies outside of a Western or even an South Asian canon. So people who are kind of looking at, but then remixing the practices that come from their environments. And I think that's very interesting. We've had a real tension around the ability to engage spirituality outside of Christianity and Islam, even in African feminist work, because so many people are tied to those dominant religions. So that's beautiful, but they are also then linked to somewhat of a movement around birth work. Because interestingly, we focus so much on the sexual that we've paid very little attention to the reproductive, and we haven't actually had that imaginative work around reproductive justice and the experience of birth and childbirth. And so there's this really beautiful movement of African birth workers who are doulas, who are midwives, who are kind of reimagining the birth process, sharing different kinds of traditions and re-expanding it out. Because, you know, a lot of contemporary practice is really biomedical. Like the preference is C-section, you know, and very medicalized birth. And there's very little movement even in the birth worker, like the biomedical birth workers around holistic birth. So I think it's, and this is across my experience across metropolitan Africa. Some rural might be another story, but so that's very beautiful. I'm quite enjoying that.
I mean, there's really ground for hope, because I see lots of women and young women across some pockets on the continent really fighting back against autocratic rule. When we think about Sudan, you know, sadly things have not changed that much, but also Kenya, you know, I've written a paper on Anita Must Go. You know, I mean, again, things have not panned out that great. And Uganda, you know, so I see pockets. We're still waiting to hear back from women in Cameroon, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Togo, in Mali, in Niger. But there is still hope, because I think right now the fight is not just for equality, and I love that, for liberation, but really for liberation, because we can fight as much as we can. But once we don't have governments that really believe and work for the people, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. But we really believe in these young women. I just wish that I had more of an activist, fiber. I'm so hyped that if I'm on an activist, I'll probably die the first day. No, frankly speaking, I will really be first line. Frankly speaking, I'm that hyped. Frankly, I'll be hyper so bad. So I probably am better being, I don't know. It's better that way for now.
Is it me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, me?
Yes, please.
I want to say, maybe it's not obvious to you because you're actually in that room, but my answer to that question is that room. You. That's, yeah, you, all of you. Because I'm not in there and I'm looking at you, and it is. You might have noticed I'm smiling this whole time. Yeah. You. Okay, done.
This was just such a beautiful panel. I've learned so much, and I'm just so energized. My name is Richa Nagar. I'm in the swags department here at Smith. So many questions, so many thoughts, but what I want to linger with is just the question of languages and audiences. And so the struggle that all of you define, I mean, I feel like there's that idea of an audience that already exists, but also the work of struggle makes its own audiences, right? So I was just I just wanted to offer that as just a point of, maybe like a, provocation or thinking about. And also in all of your reflections, you talked about Africa, or this idea of African feminism in relation to the West. But I mean, there are all of these other histories of movements, well, Indian Ocean relationships just being one example. But yeah, so I wanted to just kind of think about, and the conversation about languages was already very, very rich and layered. But if the work creates its own audience and its own languages, then what are some of the possibilities that you are already excited about that are emerging? And with looking at this new publishing collaboration, et cetera, what are some of the things that you really are hoping to agitate and build? Yeah, thank you.
I'll just
I mean, I
volunteer.
think one of the problems is sometimes I feel like we were more transnational and open to the generation of my parents, that we became a little parochial, and became even more so with the NGOization of the work, where we had more money and yet less imagination. And so it meant that it kind of narrowed the space a little bit. What I'm seeing though, and it's mainly happening through art, so through literature, through film and other things, is a re-emergence of conversations, for example, across the Black Atlantic, or like with Brazil and Colombia, as they come up with even stronger and stronger kind of Afro presence, and that conversation, not just with the West African coast, but even East Africa. There's been another resurgence of kind of work around the presence of progressive and radical South Asians in African history, and what those solidarities have looked like. And a real interest both on the part of progressive South Asians in the continent, but also from outside, and others who are looking at that relationship and making and producing things about it. But yeah, I think I actually think the NGO imagination has really limited us, because it forced us into SDGs and whatever's, and it's very narrow, and almost often not even whatever was a priority in front of us, and certainly not a priority of community. So that's been a limitation. But yeah, and I'm excited for that. I feel like there's so much of the world to re-engage, and so many conversations. And like I said, that existed a generation prior, when air travel was difficult and there was no email and no WhatsApp and whatever. And we have far less barriers now. So I feel like it just takes the question, and then we lean into it, and we create new things. Yeah.
Oh, one more, please.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Yes,
I
me.
think you had a question and a response to the question.
Well, I am very, very grateful that the Indian Ocean and the kind of variegated and layered cosmopolitanisms that sort of swirl and flex around the longue durée history of not only the African continent, but then by definition, all the other land masses through which various forms of migration and travel and interaction took place, which, may I note, is a very tight way of getting back to the first question, which is that of the always already impossible attempt to contain or even necessarily make cohesive, I'm not sure that is the point of being, what in fact it means to be whichever set of terms you choose to conjugate together, sort of in terms of African feminisms. But let me also say that I had the great honor once upon a time of organizing, helping to organize. I was working with a bunch of very cool people. And the entire idea was to surface and possibly cause to proliferate different kinds of ways of thinking of who it is we think that, or which aspects of ourselves are turned to which other parts of the world. So I think that's a really, really important question. First, because it does just deepen the historical lens through which we are talking. It is not only the last 500 years, it's not even the last 1,000 years. It's a very, very, very deep and rich space of evolving and continuing cultural formation and exchange. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, I just want to applaud, I'm sorry, I now can't remember who said, who cares about all this resisting and the writing back and I definitely share, actually I think everybody did, I definitely share that exhaustion. You know, at some point I just got so tired of, why do I have to keep proving? And remember, this was a while back when I was enmeshed in these situations. And I thought, why do I have to keep proving to a bunch of mostly white men how intelligent I am, and also how many books I've read? And yes, I understand Orientalism, and have you read? I mean, this whole sort of being enmeshed in a net of defensive scholarship, it does in fact get completely exhausting, because you're not even in charge of the racist frame that they're using. And sadly for everybody, racism is deeply, deeply unimaginative. So in fact, you find yourself answering an extraordinary number of questions about lions for reasons I'm still trying to work out. So I agree also that surely the kind of richness of context and reference to which we have access should lead, if we allow it to this magnificent, continuously productive form of creativity and imagination. And to tie in yet another question that I think slots in here is, and that is why I don't think that we have to try to do things that aid in resistance. I think oppressive forms of government are necessarily things that want the status quo of power disequilibrium, gross abuses of privilege and entitlement and hierarchical ranking in society. They want those things to stay the same. So really, by definition, almost any work of thought, of imagination, of creativity undertaken is a direct challenge, which at the same time does not have that as its reference, which I think is the best way to be. For example, I've noticed that apparently Black women, just by existing, are the kryptonite to the current administration in a certain country. And I am impressed by the amount of space that clearly Black women and or notions of Africa seem to spend living rent-free in the minds of racists all over the world. I really don't think we have to do anything about it. I think they're just doing it to I mean, look at them doing it to themselves. So that was by way of agreeing very heartily and also expressing gratitude for that question. Thank you, because I think that is a very important way in to think about the possibilities of existence in the contemporary era. But when it comes to languages, I'd like to, again, I do this a lot, I'm sorry, I'd like to again maybe expand our idea, because part of the reason that we have been talking about fabrics and songs and stories, and I talk about pictures and paintings, it is that these are all, on some level, they're a form of social text, and therefore they are communicative action. So bringing me back to my notions of materialism, because, for example, when you look at I used to do this exercise where I'd take just one thing and see how much learning, how much pedagogy could I get out of, for example, the idea of a dhow, just the idea of this boat, which is a very beautiful, elegant, classic design, instantly recognizable, just beautiful as a thing to look at, but also full of meaning and redolent both of change and continuity, modernity, and a sort of a past in the presence. That's maybe the kind of communicative languages that we should be developing, precisely by broadening our modes and means of communication beyond the ones that are currently privileged or accepted or acknowledged. So, okay, that's me done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. As much as I hate to do this, because clearly this is a fabulous generative conversation, I am going to have to formally wrap the panel, but I invite you please to, first of all, give us a giant round of applause for our I invite you to stop by the table at the back, where, as I said, both Jessica Horn and Aminata Diabate will be signing their books. I invite you to read their work also in Feminist Africa Journal, Meridians, and I invite you to come up and say hello if that's of interest as well, and to see Wambui's photography in the hallway out there. This is just the beginning. I'm so grateful for your presence here. It really affirms that this is most certainly not only worth doing, but worth growing and expanding. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meridians.